Shadows in the Mansion, Alone Together, Part 1. There was a soft rustle behind the door, and Nasha's breath caught, tension coiling tighter in her chest as she strained to catch the faintest sound. The handle turned slowly, almost hesitantly, as though the truth on the other side resisted unveiling itself. Finally, the door eased open, revealing Kehinde. Her expression was composed, but the firm set of her jaw betrayed a gravity that sent a chill through Nasha. Instinctively, her gaze darted past Kehinde, landing on Obasi, his body unnaturally still, eyes closed, his skin dull and devoid of vibrance. The sight stole the breath from her lungs, her hand flying to her mouth as a gasp tore free, muffled against her trembling fingers. "It's all right," Kehinde reassured, her voice gentle, steady. "He's going to be just fine. I haven't finished stitching him up yet, but once that's done, there will be no reason for you to worry." Relief didn't come. Kehinde's words, though meant to comfort, barely grazed the surface of Nasha's panic. The door inched closed again, slowly shutting her out, leaving her in the quiet hallway. And in that final moment before it clicked shut, a cold certainty gripped her heart. A certainty she couldn't shake. What if this is the last time I see him alive? By the time the door sealed her away, her hands were numb, fingers still trembling with the chill of fear. She backed away, her spine pressing against the cool wall, her knees threatening to buckle under the weight of her dread. She squeezed her eyes shut, desperate to find solace, but all she could hear was the sound of her own breath, quick and shallow. "Please, don't let him die." The whispered plea hung in the stillness, unanswered. Her thoughts spiraled, looping back to the same insistent fear. "He's not going to die," she told herself. "He's not." But the guilt gnawed at her with a force she couldn't fend off. It was too late. She had ruined it. This mansion, which had once been so peaceful, now felt heavy with the pain she had brought. The walls seemed to pulse with the weight of Obasi's suffering, as though they absorbed the chaos she had carried with her. She had failed to protect someone, failed to protect this place. Her mother's voice echoed faintly in her memory. "You have to bring happiness, Nasha. That is your gift." But where was that gift now? All she ever brought was heartache. All she ever left behind were broken things, broken people. She couldn't tell how long she had stood there, frozen with dread. But just as her panic threatened to swallow her whole, the door creaked open again. The faint sound broke through the haze of her thoughts, pulling her sharply back into the present. Nasha's breath caught as she looked up, her heart pounding in her chest. Kehinde stepped out, her gaze immediately finding Nasha standing in the hallway, tense. "All done," Kehinde said softly, stepping fully into the hallway. Her gaze settled on Nasha with a mix of warmth and understanding. "He'll be fine, really." There was a gentle finality in her tone, as though she hoped her words would soothe the tension etched into every line of Nasha's face. "You can go in and see him if you'd like. He's awake." The sincerity in Kehinde's expression was unmistakable. Calm, reassuring. Yet, despite the optimism radiating from her, a knot of reluctance twisted in Nasha's chest, tightening with each breath. She blinked, her eyes flickering toward the door, but her feet remained anchored to the floor. Should I check on him? The question echoed in her mind, but her body refused to move. The familiar edge of fear pressed against her, urging her to run, to flee rather than face whatever waited beyond that door. She swallowed hard, trying to summon the relief she was supposed to feel. Obasi was fine. Kehinde had said so, and now this ordeal could finally end. Yet the weight of everything, the suffocating anxiety, the tension, had stretched her nerves thin, so thin that even relief felt foreign. It was now or never. Instead of moving toward the door, she hesitated, glancing warily at Kehinde. Her voice faltered as she bit her lip, searching for the right words. "Do you think, maybe, should we take him to the hospital?" Her voice was quiet, laced with uncertainty. I could help you get him to your car." The suggestion spilled out slowly, each word deliberate, as if she were testing the ground beneath her feet with every syllable. She wrapped her arms tightly around herself, fingers digging into her sides, as though bracing for an answer she didn't want to hear. Kehinde took a deep breath, her gaze softening as she observed the young woman before her. Nasha's turmoil was plain to see, in the way her hands clenched, in the tremor that ran through her voice. The fear was substantial, almost tangible. Obasi had told her Nasha wanted to leave, and yet she hadn't. While Kehinde had been locked inside with Obasi, Nasha could have easily slipped away. So why hadn't she? What held her here? Despite Nasha's tentative courage in offering to help, Kehinde knew moving Obasi would undermine everything he had planned. And as much as she trusted Obasi, she wasn't willing to perpetuate his lie. She wouldn't mislead Nasha. Confronted by the dilemma, Kehinde chose the truth. "In his condition, it's best if he isn't moved," Kehinde said, her voice steady yet gentle. "He should rest for at least 24 hours. She hesitated for a moment before adding, "He'll be okay, but he needs care. He'll need someone to stay with him, to watch over him. Mostly there should be nothing more you need to do." The words landed like stones in Nasha's chest. The thought of being left alone with Obasi again, even in his weakened state, sent a wave of panic through her. She had been trapped with men before. What if it happened again? Her fear flared, every instinct screaming for her to run. Kehinde noticed the change in her instantly, the way dread seemed to drain the warmth from Nasha's complexion. Her slender frame seemed to shrink inwards, as though she were trying to disappear beneath the weight of her anxiety. Kehinde couldn't help but feel a flicker of guilt, mingled with a hint of resentment at being pulled into Obasi's ruse. Whatever his intentions, leaving Nasha so vulnerable didn't sit right with her. Nasha's lips parted as though she wanted to protest, yet silence held her back. Kehinde saw the silent struggle in her wide eyes, the unanswered questions that seemed to hover there, unresolved and unspoken. She imagined Nasha's mind racing, tangled with 1,000 silent what-ifs, searching for some hint of reassurance that remained out of reach. With a resigned sigh, Kehinde slipped a hand into her purse, retrieving a small business card. She pressed it gently into Nasha's trembling hand, her tone both firm and kind. "Here," she said, her voice softening. "My number is on it. If you need anything at all." She leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a whisper, as if confiding a secret. "Please don't hesitate to call me." The card felt weightless in Nasha's hand, offering no real comfort. And just as the thought crossed her mind to insist on taking Obasi to the hospital after all, Kehinde was already moving toward the back door. She slipped out with quiet efficiency, the soft click of the door shutting behind her, seeming almost too loud in the stillness of the hallway, leaving Nasha standing there, frozen with her unspoken plea. "I can't do this." The thought pounded through her mind, her pulse racing as she stared at the bedroom door. One night alone with him had been more than she could bear, far more. His presence had filled every corner of the room, a shadow she couldn't escape. Every stir, every shift he made in the bed sent ripples of danger through her, a constant gnawing reminder of the risk she was taking. And now she was supposed to walk back in there, with him awake, watching her. Fear curled tighter around her chest, screaming at her to run, to escape the mansion, to never come back. But then, the image of him lying there, injured and vulnerable, flashed in her mind. Because of me. Guilt surged again, sharp and biting. She squeezed her eyes shut, as if that could block out the relentless flood of shame, but it clung to her like an inescapable shadow, wrapping itself tighter with each passing second. He hasn't hurt me, she reasoned, grasping for a lifeline, something to make her feel safe, safe enough to face him. Maybe he's not like that, not like the others. Maybe she didn't need to be afraid of him. He was sick, helpless, and hurt because of her. But he's still a man, she thought, and men. Her mother's words echoed softly in her mind as it always did. You're meant to bring happiness to others, Nasha. It was a belief her mother had clung to, one she had tried to pass down, but happiness had always felt distant to Nasha, like something reserved for others, never for her. She had failed at it time and time again, but maybe, just this once, she could make things right. I have to fix this, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I'll fix it. She owed him that much. I can't leave him here. She couldn't walk away and leave him for the owners to find. And maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe she could still restore peace to this mansion. But then her mind snapped back to the men hunting her. They could come back. What if they're already on their way? Is this place, this man, worth the risk? She didn't know. But the memory of him, throwing himself into danger for her, flickered in her mind. He could have died. He saved me. She didn't understand why, but that didn't matter. She owed him. Her hand trembled as she reached for the door handle, each breath shallow. Her chest constricted, as though the very air she breathed was laced with fear. I have to make things right, she told herself. With a soft click, the door creaked open, the sound unnervingly loud against the dense silence that seemed to press down on her. Her gaze darted to the bed where Obasi lay, his broad frame lying still beneath the covers. A shiver ran through her, and she hesitated at the threshold, gripping the doorframe as if it were her last tether to safety. Is he asleep? She wondered, her pulse loud in her ears. His face was turned slightly away, half lost in shadow, making it impossible to see if his eyes were open or closed. Obasi? Her voice trembled, barely a whisper, the sound swallowed by the silence. There was no response. Her heart jolted in her chest, panic rising like a tidal wave. She took a tentative step closer, her feet feeling leaden, the soft thud of her footsteps unnervingly loud in the quiet room. Obasi? She repeated, her voice cracking as it edged higher, desperate for a response. But he remained motionless, not a flicker of movement, not a single twitch. The dread churning within her flared into something sharper, a cold, biting terror that gripped her with unrelenting force. Is he? Her throat tightened, and her legs quaked as she forced herself to move forward. As she stepped inside, the room seemed to close in around her, each step feeling like a descent into something darker. She was close enough now to see his chest, still and unmoving beneath the sheets. Her breath stopped painfully. Obasi, she called again, her voice barely concealing the rising panic. Still nothing. Her fists clenched, nails biting into her palms as the instinct to flee surged through her. She couldn't do this. She wasn't strong enough. But she couldn't leave him either. Not like this. With trembling legs, she took one final step and stood beside the bed. From this angle, she could finally see his face. His eyes were closed, his expression unreadable. Hesitation burned through her, but she reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed against his arm. Cold. A wave of panic crashed over her, and her voice broke free, louder, more desperate. Obasi! She cried, fear thickening every syllable. Then, just barely, his chest rose, a faint, shallow breath escaping him. His eyelids fluttered, and a low, strained groan slipped past his lips. Relief hit her like a flood, so sudden and powerful that her legs nearly gave way beneath her. She wavered, the trembling in her body refusing to still, but she remained standing. He's alive. He's okay, she told herself, the tightness in her chest easing only slightly. Yet as his eyes flickered open, just a sliver of awareness creeping into his gaze, the fear didn't leave her entirely. He was awake now, and she was alone with him once again. She had come to check on him, just to be sure he was still alive. But now that he was awake, the air felt heavier, thicker, as if it would suffocate her. His eyes fluttered open slowly, their dark depths hazy with exhaustion but sharp enough to find her standing there. Nasha! Her name was soft on his lips, almost tender, yet it made her stomach twist violently. Her pulse thundered in her ears, and before she could stop herself, she stumbled back. I thought, she stammered, her voice weak and brittle. She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't bring herself to say what she had thought. He shifted slightly under the sheets, and her heart clenched at the sight. His gaze, though heavy with weariness, pinned her in place. A weak, almost imperceptible smile played on his lips, but it did nothing to ease the tension in her chest. He was so much larger than she remembered, his body stretched across the bed, filling the space like he was part of the room itself. Even beneath the covers, she could see the strength in him, the contours of his chest, his arms, carved with a solidity that was almost otherworldly. She bit her lip, shrinking back further. He felt too close, too much. Even in his weakened state, the sheer presence of him overwhelmed her. His dark eyes softened, lingering on her as though he could see past the surface, searching for the secrets buried in the shadows of her soul. The intensity of his gaze made her chest tighten, and she turned her face away, unable to hold it. The sharp snap of a twig outside shattered the moment. She flinched, her body jerking as her wide eyes darted toward the window, scanning the darkness with frantic desperation. Her breath quickened, every nerve on edge as she strained to catch a glimpse of whoever, or whatever, might be moving outside. "You're safe here," Obasi said suddenly, his voice low and steady, cutting through her spiraling panic. There was a calm certainty in his tone that seemed almost impossible. "No one's going to hurt you." He paused, his jaw tightening slightly before adding with quiet conviction, "That man won't be back." "You don't know that," she whispered, her voice trembling as she fought to maintain her composure. His words had caught her off guard, and a flicker of disappointment bloomed within her, disappointment in herself for letting her fear slip through the cracks. She froze, her fists tightening at her sides. It was clear he meant to comfort her, but he doesn't understand. Her heart pounded heavily, each beat resonating with the weight of the truth she couldn't bring herself to say. He doesn't know what they're capable of. She dared a glance at him. His brow furrowed slightly, like he was studying her, trying to unravel her secrets. Her skin prickled under the scrutiny, and she turned away again. Obasi's gaze softened as he watched her struggle to hold herself together. She looked as if she might shatter under the weight of her own fear. It pained him to see her like this, trembling, her voice quivering with a vulnerability she couldn't seem to hide. He longed to reassure her, to say something that might ease the tension coiled in her body. But how could he when her fear wasn't only of the world, it was of him too? He had heard her approach long before she stepped into the room. Every hesitant step, every subtle shift of her breathing as she lingered outside the door, had resonated in him like a drumbeat. When her hand brushed the doorknob, he had already closed his eyes, pretending to sleep. And then she spoke, her voice trembling, laced with fear as she called his name. It was still intoxicating, the sound of his name on her lips so surreal. He fought the urge to respond, to open his eyes and take her in fully. She was only feet away, so close at last. She was like a bird, an exotic creature he had no business being this close to. perched unnervingly near, yet always ready to take flight. If he moved too quickly, if he even breathed too loudly, she might flee, vanishing beyond his reach forever. Once he had opened his eyes, she had almost vanished, and he could see the restraint it took for her to stay. Now he clenched his jaw, frustration simmering beneath his calm exterior. What had been done to her? Who had instilled this level of terror, this inability to trust? This wasn't the girl who had taken over his shower and his bed with discerning confidence. That girl had moved through his mansion like she belonged there. Graceful and self-assured, her every step a silent declaration of presence. Her aura had been magnetic, her eyes piercing straight into his, unearthing parts of himself he hadn't dared to confront in years. But the girl before him now was different. She couldn't meet his gaze. She stood so far from him that it felt as though she were trying to erase herself from the room entirely. Her fear wrapped around her like a shroud, and every movement screamed fragility, as if even her own shadow frightened her. She flinched at the faintest sound, her wide eyes darting toward the windows as if the shadows themselves might come alive. Should he say it again? That Kelechi wouldn't be back. Would it reassure her or only deepen her terror? The truth pressed heavily on him. Kelechi wouldn't dare return. Not now that he was here. But how could he make her believe that? How could he show her she was safe with him when even his words, his mere presence, seemed to unravel her? Obasi's chest tightened, protectiveness surging within him as he watched her tremble, her fear palpable in the tense air between them. His hands clenched at his sides as a wave of helplessness washed over him. Every instinct urged him to close the distance between them, to hold her, to shield her from whatever ghosts haunted her. But the slightest move might send her spiraling further into panic. Uncertainty gnawed at him. Would a girl like this ever see him as anything but a threat? Say something, he thought, urging himself. The silence between them deafening now, heavy with tension and unspoken words. After a long moment, the discomfort of lying so stiffly became too much. His chest throbbed faintly, a dull reminder of the wound, but he needed to shift, if only slightly. With a quiet breath, he braced himself and tried to adjust his position. The pain struck like lightning. A sharp, searing agony tore through his chest, stealing the air from his lungs. His body jerked involuntarily, a low, strangled sound escaping his lips before he could stop it. Nasha's head snapped up at the sound, her heart leaping into her throat. "Obasi," she whispered, her voice trembling. He didn't answer. His body tensed, his hand clutching his chest as his face twisted in pain. A groan rumbled from his throat as he slumped back against the pillows, his chest rising and falling in uneven gasps. The sight froze her in place. Her breath hitched, her blood running cold as her mind spiraled. No, not again. The memory crashed over her, vivid and unrelenting. Her mother, frail, fading, lying in that bed. Nasha had clung to her, too young to understand the heaviness of her breathing, the dullness that had overtaken her rich brown skin, the unnatural greyness creeping into her lips. By the time she realized the truth, it was already too late. The woman who had been her whole world had slipped away, and she had done nothing. Helpless, powerless. Her chest tightened, the drumbeat of her heart pounding in her ears. She couldn't live through that again. Not again. "Obasi," she cried, her voice cracking with desperation. She stumbled toward him, her knees weak beneath her. Her hands trembled as they reached for him, her fingers brushing against his arm before clutching his hand tightly. His skin was hot, fevered, and her cold fingers trembled as they wrapped around his. "You can't die," she sobbed, her voice breaking. Her free hand hovered over his shoulder, unsure where to land. Her breaths came in panicked gasps, the words spilling from her lips like a plea. Please, you can't die. Not because of me. You can't. Her mother's words echoed in her mind, unbidden but relentless. You are meant to bring joy, my love. Wherever you go, bring light. But she hadn't brought light. She hadn't brought joy. Her mother had died, and now Obasi was lying here, slipping away, and it was all her fault. Again. Always her fault. I won't let this happen, she choked out, her tears streaming freely. Her grip on his hand tightened, desperate, as though her touch alone could tether him to life. Obasi stirred faintly, the pain still a sharp, constant presence, but the frantic sound of her voice pulled him from the haze. Nasha, he rasped, his voice hoarse and barely audible. She froze, her tear-streaked face lifting toward him. Her eyes, wide and shimmering with dread, met his. He blinked sluggishly, the weight of his eyelids heavy, but he managed to hold her gaze. I'm not dying, he murmured, though his words were strained, each syllable a fight against the pain. Her sobs continued, her chest heaving as she shook her head. You can't, she whispered. You can't leave, not because of me. Obasi's brow furrowed, confusion flickering in his dark eyes. He couldn't make sense of the sheer terror in her voice, the way her small hands clung to his as though her very life depended on it. His chest ached, not from his wound, but from the sight of her like this, trembling, broken, and crying over him. It was a vulnerability he hadn't expected, and it cut deeper than any blade could. It wasn't just fear, though. He could see it now. Guilt. A weight she carried as heavily as her dread. Nasha, he said softly, his voice steadier this time. He shifted his hand slightly, his fingers curling faintly around hers in a gesture of reassurance. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. Her wide eyes met his again, and for a moment she seemed to hesitate, her breathing still uneven. Slowly she nodded, though the tension in her body didn't fully ease. She didn't believe him, couldn't. Obasi watched her carefully, his dark gaze steady. He didn't understand the depth of her reaction, the raw pain that seemed to emanate from her very soul. He gave her hand a gentle squeeze, his touch light but grounding. And though her grip loosened slightly, her trembling didn't stop. She wiped at her face with a shaky hand, her lips quivering as she whispered, I'm sorry. Obasi shook his head weakly, his gaze never leaving hers. Don't be, he said, his tone soft, soothing. She bit her lip, her gaze falling as fresh tears threatened to spill over. A wave of searing pain tore through him, sharp and unrelenting, forcing a low groan from his throat. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to breathe through it, swallowing back the expletives that burned at the edges of his mind. Kehinde had warned him about the pain, but he hadn't expected it to feel like being sliced open all over again. The shock of it left him momentarily immobilized, a cold realization settling in. He couldn't move, even if he tried. His body felt like a prison, each shallow breath a battle against the throbbing ache radiating from his wound.